Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by Dimitrios Lopez. He is the author of Thumos Rising, which is available everywhere books are sold. And we don't know a ton about this book yet, but that's okay because that's the job of this podcast, is for us to find out. So, welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thanks, Cameron. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you. Well, why don't we begin from the beginning and find out a little bit about yourself and your book?
Okay. So, again, I write under the name Dimitrios Lopez, but I actually teach for a living. That's my day job. I teach Latin and ancient Greek and a little bit of ancient history on the side at a university in Dallas, Texas. I am a child of the 80s. I grew up being a huge He-Man and the Masters of the Universe fan. And I guess when I was maybe mid to late 20s, I went into a Barnes and Noble and I was hoping to find a novelization of the He-Man characters. So, something like in the world of not proper fanfic because it's sold in Barnes and Noble, but the kind of stuff they have for Star Trek and X-Men and some of these other, IPs that you have out there. I was hoping for something from that universe and from those particular characters, and I couldn't find it. And I was much dismayed and quite to my horror that, it just seemed that there was something greatly wrong with the universe. There wasn't a He-Man book out there that takes the characters that I loved as a kid, but treated them in a more adult, more mature fashion. So I properly went home and started writing my own He-Man fanfic, and then that eventually broke away and became very much its own thing, and sort of similar to, as I understand, what 50 Shades of Grey was to Twilight. I eventually decided to make it my own thing and go through with publication. And so that story that I initially wrote became the bones, became the skeleton of my new book, the first in a sci-fi fantasy series, Sigma Book One, Thumos Rising, and heavily influenced by He-Man, heavily influenced by a lot of other IPs over the years. I'm sure we'll get into some of those, but also heavily influenced by my study of the classics, not only the Greco-Roman world, but also just ancient history and sort of pre-industrialized peoples the globe over.
Well, yes. Why don't we start from the beginning? Who's our main character? Who do we believe in, and what is he up to?
Okay, so the main character is a man named Zeno, and what he believes in is he believes in love. His problem is that he is living in a world that's been torn apart because it's been invaded by a vampiric alien from among the stars who has come down and established himself as the totalitarian leader of this world and really sort of set the whole thing at grips with each other. And so Zeno believes that the love of his life has been lost, has been slain. And I said believe there, so you probably know where that's going. But ultimately, as we go through the story, Zeno finds out that he also is the heir to an alien civilization, an extraterrestrial civilization, and one, in fact, that fought the civilization that this vampiric character comes from, my antagonist, who in this first book one is just called the vampire. And that because he is an heir to that civilization, he has access to the power to fight and ultimately defeat this monstrous alien creature. But again, sort of a la, as they say, Muhammad, when he received his first prophet or his first, I guess, vision, responds to it with a lot of fear, a lot of self-doubt, like, I don't think I'm worthy of this power. And even if I am, I really don't want it. But then when he eventually finds out that the love of his life is still alive and actively fighting in the war, he takes up this power, he joins the fray. And so ultimately, Cameron, it is fantasy. We have dragons and magic systems and, knights on horseback. We have that stuff. But we also have spaceships, laser guns, technology, obviously aliens. We have those things as well. But at its heart, it's really a Superman story. It's a Superman story. You have a very sort of godlike, messianic type Superman character that's put in this very alien world and but ultimately having to think through and figure out, okay, how do I use this power responsibly? Are there limits to this power? How far am I prepared to take it? And having to ask some of those questions and figure out his own way, how to be a god or at least a demigod, but also not completely losing touch with his humanity.
Oh, absolutely. So I no, that's good. And there is of course, the moment I start speaking,
You're
my throat goes.
happens.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that's always how it goes. Um, so let's let me unpack a couple things. I don't think I've met anyone who has ever been inspired to write literature from a cartoon that I think was created to sell toys.
That's it. You
It's
got
one of
it.
those. The
Yep.
cartoon was the sales vehicle for the toys. Um,
Yep.
in the 80s, that's quite what was it about those stories and whatnot that got you going and
Hooked
made you
me.
excited?
Yeah, I would say probably about three things. One, okay, so I guess some of this you got to sort of unpack the origins of He-Man a little bit, and even speaking back into the toy line. Now, again, I
Right.
am not a toy or a Mattel or even a He-Man scholar per se. Okay, I don't have a PhD in that. However, my understanding
I
is
sincerely
that
hope that no one does.
right, you never know, but my understanding is that initially they had gotten a contract to run some toys for the Conan the Barbarian movie that I want to say was released in '82. This was the Arnold Schwarzenegger film.
Right.
And for whatever reason, the contract fell through, but they had these prototypes and they invested some money. They wanted to make it work. And so they, again, invented this own character. But my take on He-Man is that he was sort of a third Conan. He was sort of a third Star Wars in respect to the world that he's in as
Right.
well, because it does have those fantasy and sci-fi aspects. But he's also a third Superman because he is this incredibly powered character that's, and even in the cartoon, there are some elements of, okay, how exactly do I use this power and am I worthy of it? So, sprinkling a little Lovecraftian horror in there because some of the monsters and some of the beasts and some of the, multiverse aspects, I mean, they were all there. Again, I'm a fan. So, I mean, I would say that He-Man was a little ahead of his time. But I think it's the mix of the fantasy and the sci-fi elements with the addition of, which I think would be interesting enough sort of on its own, but then you throw in this, again, Superman-esque character that has all these amazing powers, and it's like, okay, well, what is actually the right thing to do here? Do I kill Skeletor? Well, that seems like an abuse of my power. Then again, I mean, if I don't, he's going to come back, cause more harm later. Having to work through these moral conundrums, really captured me. So I want to, and again, I'm
Yeah.
big fans of those other things too. Like I'm big fans of Conan, big fan of Superman, and big fan of again the Lovecraftian kind of cosmic horror. And so I really think He-Man in some ways was my gateway drug to all of those other characters. And
Mm.
it's the same things I loved about those, I loved in He-Man. It's just I got them all in one place to a lesser degree, be sure, but it was kind of a one-stop shop.
Yes, I definitely get that. I'm amazed. I've never heard someone discuss this stuff in this way before. Because a lot of those shows are so
They're campy.
thin and sort of
Yeah.
throwaway, and the
Cringy.
storylines have all the depth of a tea saucer sort of thing.
Yeah,
So
sure.
it's an interesting. It's great because to have someone who's taken a genuine interest in something like that and looks at it for more than what it is and through this lens is wonderful. So,
Well, and a little bit of maybe, I guess, kind of American pop culture here. I mean, again, that was the early 80s. That was right around the time of the great Dungeons and Dragons sort of satanic panic, right? I mean, again, it was a different
yeah.
world in a lot of ways. And again, my understanding is that one of the things the producers of the show had to do, because it was one of those first cartoons that was aired every single weekday, right? A lot of the shows would just air on the weekends, but that was the first one that Monday through Friday, at least for those first couple of years, you got a new show. But one of the things they had to do because it was so popular was they had to sort of put these moral lessons into the show at the end. And in my case, I grew up in a single parent household. I to this day still haven't met my dad, my biological father. So in some ways, I mean, this is going to maybe the quote of the podcast there, Cameron. I kind of learned my morality and sort of what it was like to be a man from He-Man, right? And again, I mean, it's very um, obviously imperfect, and yes, with about as much depth as a very shallow glass of water there. But it landed right. I mean, I can just remember
Yeah.
watching shows where he there's one particular show where he had this power crystal and Skeletor was trying to get it, but then He-Man found it, and then but it's kind of like Frodo in the Ring, right? Because it tempts you to take it and use it for evil. And he's like, there's a couple, it's about a minute and a half in the show where he goes through this like monologue and he's like talking through it. Well, I could do this or I could do that. Again, I just found those elements just so fascinating. And
No, that's
again, I
great.
guess it plays to a lot of my interests, in like Greek philosophy and those kind of things to this day.
Yeah, no, no, I know. Like I said, I mean, it's always, I am always amazed as someone who was both simultaneously deeply affected by media, but not the media that affected most people. Like,
Sure, sure.
I was over in the corner, reading Vogue and being like, I want to live
Mhm.
like the people in these pages, and I want to move to New York and, and like be an interior designer or something like that, which you can see how
Sure.
well that turned out, didn't happen, and sort of thing. And like this um I am uh I'm always amazed at what media affects people, and
Yeah,
sometimes it's not where we would look, and I think most of us,
yeah.
at least me, would not be looking here for media that deeply affected someone. But I think it's fascinating. It got, I mean, it was vital to you, and it reached out to you and
Right.
affected you and then created this creativity. And I think that, I mean, that's magical. I think anyone who worked on that show would be very impressed, sort of
Yeah,
thing,
yeah.
and not realize, like, hey, yeah, you guys were doing a show whose job was to sell plastic toys, but one person who really needed a positive masculine influence was deeply affected by your marketing piece. That's
Well,
magical. I'm sorry. That's the magic of
oh
media
yeah,
right there, for sure.
absolutely. Well, and I think there's something special to be said, specifically just for genre media, genre fiction, whether you find it in films, books, comics, whatever it may be. So the example that I guess a couple examples that come immediately to mind, following World War II, there was some very strict regulations, put down by the U.S. on what the Japanese sort of could and could produce. Again, not necessarily World War II scholar, but this is my understanding.
Yeah.
And so it was very difficult to sit down and have a conversation about the sort of terrors of living in the atomic age in the country, the only country that had had two atomic weapons or bombs dropped on it, right? A conversation that desperately needed to be had in that time and in that moment, but you couldn't really have it. But what they could do is they could make Godzilla, right?
Right.
Which punches a lot of those same notes. Like, what kind of proverbial monsters are we unleashing on the world when we sort of take war to this sort of total, full end? And then I guess the other one would just be, again, I've said it a couple times, or reference the character, but one of the fascinating things about Superman is it really is an opportunity for you to analyze the character, kind of what you do or don't think about God, whether you believe in God at all, right? And all powerful, all loving. I think you can. I've always said that if you tell me what someone thinks about Superman, I could probably tell you how they feel about at least the Judeo-Christian God, right?
Yeah.
Because and even like something like when Zack Snyder makes Man of Steel, and again, I don't know if you've had a chance or if you've seen that film or if you like it or whatever, but something as simple that spoiler alert, at the end of the movie when he kills the villain, so many fans that freaked out. They're like, oh well, Superman doesn't kill people because he's supposed to be held to this moral standard, higher standard, and you're like, okay, well, contextually, in the story, it kind of make all that to say, right? I mean, I don't know. People, it really does touch people in a lot of ways, and I think it allows us to have kind of what some people refer to these emotional pumps, right? Some of these things and some of these themes just hit too close to home.
Mhm.
It's very hard for people to have a conversation about God or war or love or justice in some of these instances. But what you can do is you can create these fictional characters, these fictional worlds, set up the system more or less the same, and then I think it does give people almost a chance to speak to it with some clarity. I think the best fiction uses lies to tell a truth that's deeper than true, and that's what I hope to be doing in my book as well.
Yes, no, that's tremendous. I will admit I'm one of those people who is, I don't really engage with comic books as media, and I
Sure.
certainly don't really watch the movies. I've only ever seen a hand of that entire genre. I've only watched less than five.
Right. 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 Right.
In fact, the only one I really enjoy, and I was talking about this with someone the other day, is the '90s Batman Doctor Freeze with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Uma Thurman. That one movie, if it's on television, I'll stop and watch.
Right. Right.
Sort of thing. If I'm in a hotel somewhere, I'll stop and watch. It's great. And it's very cartoony. It's not like the movies are now, which are all
Yeah.
very serious and all this type of
Yeah.
thing. It is, it feels like a cartoon. It feels like a comic book. It makes no pretense of being anything other than that.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. But yeah, I don't tend to engage in a lot of that stuff myself. It was not a part of my growing up at all, so
Yeah. Sure.
I don't
Sure. Sure.
tend to get into all of that. So, but I'm fascinated by people who are. One of my friends is Dr. Pete Coogan. He wrote the definitive book on superheroes.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, which I was really happy I was able to work with a publishing partner and get that republished last year. And he and I have had a 3 year long multi back and forth discussion about superheroes and genre and all this type of thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's very fascinating because he is steeped in that, and I am steeped in classical literature. I have my official book list on CameronJournal.com of
Mm.
that I've been working on for years and years because I had a buddy in college that was like, "How are you so well read?" And I'm like, "Well, I've
Oh,
read this
wow.
and I've read that, all this type of thing."
Right.
And then I started writing them down. People would ask, "Oh, what should I?" And I started passing this list around.
You got the list.
And then eventually I created I created this sort of master list of, here's what I think you should be writing. And um I did do an interview one time with someone whose grandfather was a victim of the Holocaust, and he was questioned a lot
Oh,
why I recommended people read Mein Kampf, which is on the official book list. That was a very fun interview.
I
His
bet.
family
I
is
bet.
Hungarian. It was very awkward, but I'm
I'll
like,
have to go
well, if
back
you
and look
want
at
to
that one.
understand fascism, you got to read the literature, sort of thing. But
Sure.
even we have sometimes have to go in an uncomfortable direction.
Oh, yeah.
Um, but it is an interesting. I think when it comes to the classical end of things, this is going somewhere. I promise.
Oh, no.
Um,
Go ahead.
when it comes to the classical end of things, how do you feel like your influence and all of that? How has your writing rather been influenced by that background as well?
Yeah. So there's kind of I guess, a more shallow answer than there's a deeper answer. I'll start with the shallow answer first. So, again, doing Greek and Latin, a lot of the characters in the book, especially when I start talking about the pantheon and the religious systems, and some of the historical figures, again, just the world building aspects of it, right? They are heavily influenced. Probably the best example of that would be in Greek, you have this word charis. It's where we get charisma from. If you look it up in a dictionary, it means grace, charm, or thanks. But a lot of these Greek words in particular, one English equivalent doesn't quite get you there because, it's written in a specific time, specific culture, how it's actually used in the literature. All that to say, in the Greek mind, charis it is a feminine noun because ancient Greek has these gendered nouns, masculine, feminine, and neuter, but it's also a exclusively feminine trait. So in my world, in the world of Nineveh, where the Sigma series takes place, you have Charis, who is the goddess of love. She's also the goddess of marriage. She's also the goddess of matriarchal wisdom. And she sort of has these different hats. Again, somewhat similar to how the Romans and the Greeks did it, right? You had Poseidon, Earthshaker, god of earthquakes. You had Poseidon, master of the tides, kind of his big job, god of the sea. You had Poseidon, tamer of horses, because Poseidon was also associated with horses and horse breeding. And so in my case, you have Charis, the matriarch, who sort of has this intergenerational wisdom, sort of guiding women generation after generation. You have Charis, the matron, who is like this goddess of marriage. But then you also have Charis, the whore, who is, if your husband cheats on you, you could probably blame Charis the whore. She got a hold of him, right? It's like the devil made me do it, Charis made me do it. Yeah,
Right.
if you're tempted to cheat on you, something like that, right? It's just sort of working it all in. Even the title Sigma, it's in many ways the entire series is going to be building up to be an allegory for ancient Stoicism. And in the Stoic philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom is sort of that is the great thing that will set us all free, right? That will set humanity free. This pursuit of Sophia, wisdom, in Greek starts with an S, and in the Greek alphabet, that is a sigma. Again, also, it just so happens sigma S, Superman, it kind of fits on a couple different levels. So that's some of the more shallow ways that it affects it. And some of the more, I guess, profound and deeper ways, Zeno's journey is in some way, again, he's going to get to a very stoic place, but he starts out, there's kind of a number of Greek myths and characters that he's patterned off of. Many of my other characters are also patterned off Greek characters and mythology or Greek civilizations. I have a whole society of warrior women that are pretty much my version of the Amazons, just for example. But he's got a lot of Achilles in him, at least in this first book. And a lot of people hear that name and people have different opinions. But the thing about Achilles is he is very given to his emotions, but he's also someone who is not above apologizing and admitting when he was wrong. And again, if you read the Iliad, by the time you get to the end and he gives the body of Hector back to the king of Troy, that's
Right.
his way of saying, hey, look, I'm sorry. I took it too far. Right. And so that's somewhat what Zeno is struggling with. And again, his challenges aren't the same as Achilles. He doesn't have sort of this, he doesn't have the rage of Achilles per se. But in Zeno's case, he is a highly empathetic character. And so, and you might think, well, empathy has no problem, there's no downside to empathy, but well, an empathetic person, might see someone tugging on the leash of their dog a little too hard, and they might decide to go overboard about that, right? I mean, I guess a great example of that is my daughter loves cats. And every time someone says something about not liking cats, she's just like, well, I'm going to punch them in the face. And in her mind, like, this is the appropriate way you deal with someone that's not nice to cats or that doesn't properly appreciate cats. All that to say, like, he's got
Most
to.
of the internet would agree with her, so I would say she's on
Right.
trend.
No, absolutely. Listen, I don't know if you've ever heard of this film, The American Tale, but it's an old sort of kids movies from the 80s. If you've seen it, there's this song, There Are No Cats in
No, I have
America.
the complete collection in my
You
hard
know it. You
drive.
know it.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
We were gonna watch it the other night, and she's like, "I'm not gonna watch that. I don't want to be part of anything that says there's no cats in America." Anyway, it's just kind of funny. But all that to say, again,
That's when you put on Aristocats and go from that. That's the movie for her from the
that was
90, from
it.
the 80s. So
No, no,
that's
no. That's actually one of the next ones on our list. Actually, the
and
Aristocats.
then
Yeah.
Oliver and Company, Pro Cat.
Right, 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 right. Lots of favorable cat characters in that.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, anyway, it's just again the sort of the struggles that some of these characters go through, having to figure out, okay, what is my role in this world where the good guys don't always win and the gods can be cruel and men can be treacherous and there's real life monsters everywhere you look. That's what Zeno's trying to figure out too.
Yes, yes, no, I think this is fascinating. I think this is because I don't write this way at all. Um,
Mm.
my fiction has a lot. My first novel was about a young man who kills his stepfather with a cast iron frying pan in his life afterwards. Um,
Oh wow.
Prison, homelessness,
Okay.
and all this sort of thing. That's what I do. I write very slice of life sort of,
Right.
that's an interesting situation someone might find themselves in. So this is all very fascinating because I don't do this at all. Like so
Right. Oh
it yeah,
no.
it's very yeah,
You write
it's
real literature, Cameron. It sounds like you're really tackling like the marrow of life, and I'm over here talking about, well, does he use the dragon, to burn the village that has the slaves, or does he not, or what does he do?
yeah, no, it's yeah, but I do have one project that I love. So I am an autistic that is way too in my head. And when I was a kid, because I was autistic and therefore had no friends,
Mm.
I and all this sort of thing, I kind of invented like my own like fantastic land to go and play and exist in that was much nicer than the world that I was forced to live in. And so I would make up all these stories about and all this type of thing. Well, fast forward many years later, and I started kind of taking that universe and writing it down
Okay.
in some of these stories and some of these ideas. And so when you talk about heroes and how these things can end up being very complicated, I'm mindful of how how that trilogy ends. And I will tell you because by the time I finish writing it, everyone will have forgotten that they've heard this. And if anyone becomes a super fan, they'll go back and find this and see
Good for
how,
them.
yes,
Yeah,
sort of,
yeah.
yes,
They've
it'll
earned
be
it.
good on them. And in the end, you have this military officer who's been working for your local monarch. Um,
Hmm.
and this is set in what in our world would be the 1930s or so.
Okay.
And it's basically brother versus, brother. It's like if Prince Harry would gather troops in France to invade England against William, sort of thing. Well, in this
Ah,
universe, one brother has ascended the throne at his father's behest and the oldest has been cast out. A group of people try to get him back in power so that they can take over the whole country. And
sure.
the whole thing ends, and the evil brothers plot fails, of course, as it does, and the local monarch sends his hero off to go arrest or kill his brother, but he really hopes he arrests him. Well,
Mm.
after many years of this fighting going on, the hero's kind of like, screw that. And he captures him, takes him to a battleship, and puts two in the back of his head on the foredeck. And then says, yeah,
Yeah,
put him in the icebox, sort of thing.
right.
And when I was writing that, I was because at first it was kind of like, oh yes, he should go and arrest him and collect him, and I was thinking like, oh, and we'll have this trial and think of the headlines, and I'm kind of like, no, this hero is traumatized. They've
Oh,
been through
sure.
a naval battle where half the navy got blown
Right.
out of the water. He had a
Yep.
ship shot out from under him. He has been through all of this stuff. His mother has passed on. There's been this terrible invasion. It has rended society apart. He is not just going to collect this guy. No, 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 no,
Sure.
no.
Yeah.
This guy is traumatized. He's had to do a lot of growing up. I mean, by the time this whole story is, he's not even 30 by the time this whole story
Mhm.
ends. So it's like, no, 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 no. He's going to go for revenge,
Not how this
and
would
he
go
has the
down. Yeah.
legal right to do it. And his
Right.
boss ain't going to be none the too happy about it, but he's going to feel better, sort of thing. And then in the fourth book I planned, he kind of gets exiled away from the capital as
For that
punishment for
decision.
the
Yeah.
I told you you could do that, but you weren't supposed to, and I'm going to be mad at you for a while, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so when you were talking about all of that, I was thinking like, yeah, sometimes stuff does get complicated, and there is that that sort of element, and I had never thought about it that way. I was thinking from a human, like he's traumatized and he has all these feelings, and therefore it'd be much better, that's he's going to do this. But I like your framework better. It's nicer. It's kinder than mine. So
Well, yeah, and I think it's also kind of, that example from your work, I think really speaks to sometimes people will ask me like, well, do you have an idea of how have you mapped out the series and everything that's going to happen? And I tell people, well, I kind of know where the finish line is. I definitely know where the finish line is. I'm not entirely sure how we're going to get there. I mean, I've got kind of an idea, right? But I guess trying to say that these characters, I really feel like take on a life of their own. And I have a
yes,
very analogous story with one of the love interest slash the female protagonist, who, she is, as I say, not a damsel in distress. She's a damsel that causes distress. Very much a warrior fighting, arm in arm with Zeno by his side. But I originally wrote her character, her climax at the end of the story in a certain way. And then I got their camera and I'm just like, well, she just wouldn't do this. Like
yeah.
that's just not who she is, right? I mean, that's not the decision she would make. Those are not her values. And I think that's a thing of like talking about getting inside a character's head when you figure out what a character's values are and then understand a little bit of their psychology. So like in your case, you can say, okay, having been through A, B, C, D, E, all the way through F, like, no, like there's not going to be any trial. We're going to take care of this problem right now, and we're going to deal with the consequences, whatever they may be after the fact. To me, I don't know. I feel like those are really the best stories in that the characters surprise even the authors. If they're surprising the
No,
authors, they're
I
probably
think
surprising
I
the readers
think
too.
that's when you have a book that's viable, is
Yeah.
when you lose a certain amount of control of what the characters are doing and they kind of start deviating from the plan. That's when I
Yeah.
think you've got something. If you've written a whole book and you have slavishly followed your entire plan completely with no deviations, I would recommend revision.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and a rethink. And I think the other thing, and I don't know if this is present in your work, but it's certainly present in mine. Because I write so much of my work is set in real world with real life situations.
Mm.
Characters change over time. Stuff
Oh yeah,
happens. I mean, at
right.
the beginning of the series, my hero, Ashley Barrison, is this, bright, young-faced officer. His father was in the Navy. He wants to be in the Navy. This is what you do. The book opens with his father having just passed, and he's ready to fulfill his father's legacy. By the end, he's exhausted. He's burnt
Mhm.
out. He has been chasing nefarious forces all over the three realms, sort of thing. And that's some kind of lies. No, he'd be very traumatized. And
Yeah,
so the young, bright officer who'd be kind of like, you're under arrest, is like, no, I'm going to definitely kill you with witnesses because you have, destroyed so much and I love my country and you almost brought us all to our knees and
yeah.
tens of thousands have died. I think that, I mean, if there's kind of one piece of advice I would give is like, let characters change over time. These things, anyone who's
Oh
talked to anyone
yeah.
who's actually been to actual war knows it changes
Oh
you
God, yes,
in
yeah.
1,000 ways that you don't
Oh
even
yeah,
know. And
yeah.
so it's good when your characters kind of change and shift over time.
Well, and I guess going back to like maybe in my case, like the classicals and the Greco-Roman
Right.
focus. I mean, that is something that I always deeply appreciate about the character of Achilles in the Iliad, right? Like as you go through, like what matters to him changes when he experiences insult, great insult, and then great loss, and then he goes through the rage, and then he has to sort of come back to his baseline. And I mean, he's not the only one. I mean, I could name a number of other examples, from the classical canon, but exactly right. I mean, the sort of just process of living and going through whatever traumatic experience, it's going to have an effect. And listen, I mean, I don't know. To me, I always think of like, I don't know if you ever saw the film Back to the Future, but like Marty McFly, right? Who's basically, listen, great movies, fun, right? I mean, just not really a lot to hate there at all. But Marty McFly is basically the same at the beginning of the first one as he is at the ending of the third one. I mean, a little bit
Yeah.
wiser, not quite as, egotistical. But I mean, generally speaking, to me, like that's a fairly flat character arc, very plot driven. And look, it again, great films. I'd swear by them. That being said, again, I really appreciate someone that's willing to take a character, especially a protagonist, and show them going through those dark, challenging times, show them being tested, and show them failing. Because look, I mean, in real life, we are all going to fail some moral tests by our own standards, right? Like in the fullness of
Yes.
time. And then we're all going to grow, and then we're hopefully going to do better, right? And again, one of my favorite quotes is success is continually having better and less dire problems. I mean, I think that's true in the, the philosophical sense as well. And so watching where a character comes up at the end of that, like how do they develop? How do they grow? In the case of Zeno, right, again, he starts off very empathetic, very idealistic, very much desperate to hold on to his humanity. But then as the series progresses, that changes. And he almost takes, again, I'll throw out another title here, but if you or any of the listeners familiar with Watchmen by Alan Moore, he
Oh,
takes this
yes.
very like Dr. Manhattan-esque, like, listen, like all I see is molecules in the void. Like this is the best way to stack the molecules. I don't care what anybody thinks about it anymore, right? I'm not following your rules. He'll kind of go through his sort of super bad Superman arc, but then eventually he's going to come back. And to me, that's also, it's like, as you were saying, it's like if you're following the script, you might want to, think about revisions. Um, yeah, I also think, right, if the characters are exactly where they are when they began,
Mm.
um, then again, you might want to like rethink about some of the things you're putting the characters through. Also, if you don't trust your characters enough that you can't put them in these really difficult situations, and trust that they are ultimately going to do the right thing, like ultimately they are going to come through and find their truth. I think that says something about the character, right? Um,
Yeah.
so
No,
yeah,
no. I mean, I think yes. I mean, I think there is. Yes, I think characters do have to go. If there's one complaint I have about a lot of these superhero comic book based movies
oh
and media
sure,
and
yeah,
whatnot is the characters don't really change that much. They're
right,
slavishly tied to the same old value, sort of thing. You never have, I think that's kind of why, like, I think Batman's kind of unique. He's been allowed to change and develop. The
Yeah,
Batman we see today
agreed.
is not the Batman we had a long time ago, and I think
Right.
that's I think and I'll just take him over several films, but that's character development in a way that most other superheroes, quite frankly, don't enjoy. You know, for all those movies
Yeah.
and reboots, Superman's never really gotten that type of treatment. And the Marvel universe is marketing and PR at this point. I mean, that nothing. I mean,
Oh yeah.
it's a lot of battle scenes and a lot of very fancy effects animated by a hordes of
Yeah.
people in South Korea, but nothing's happening to them. No, those people aren't emotionally reacting to the things around them, you
Yeah,
know.
sure. Well, I think it's, like with Superman, you almost have the opposite problem. It's like if you try to evolve the character, again, I sort of refer to him as kind of the American Jesus. Like people get really pissed off, right? If you treat this
Yeah,
Superman in a way that they think is disrespectful. But no, I think I also think there's something interesting to be said about, again, like the unique thing about Batman outside of all those other characters you've talked about. And you're like, okay, if you Superman's sort of like the God character, right? In some ways, I think it makes sense that people get so upset when you try to have the character growth. Whereas with Batman, like he is a man, right? He is a human, right?
right.
He's an exceptional human, but he's still a human. And so I think in some ways that like his strength is that he can grow in a way that, oh, I don't know, again, like you said, some of these other characters just don't. And you're right. I mean, generally speaking, like as far as the films go, I mean, pretty much you've seen one, you've seen them all, and a lot of them's the same. And I guess to be honest with you, as much as I've talked about it, like I'm really not a big fan of most of them myself. Like some of them I think are unique and special. I could, maybe list about five. And some are, sometimes people will get into genre literature and films for escapism as well. And I don't begrudge anyone that, right? Like if you want to go like run around the bottom of the ocean with Jason Momoa,
Hmm.
have him talking to an octopus. Listen, it's
Yeah,
funny. I think Momoa's hilarious. You know what I'm saying? It's, I would not begrudge anyone that either. Um, but yeah,
yeah,
I guess it is frustrating for me from a consumer and from a fan standpoint, and that like to me, like I like to see stuff closer to the more recent oh God, what was it? It was Godzilla minus one, right? Which was again a very serious take, by right made in Japan, by the way. On the character, to me, that's just more interesting than you go watch the American, like you said. It's like CGI. Yeah, it's just 2 hours of like WWE monsters whooping each other's asses, right?
no, I mean,
But
and
I
then
also understand these
yeah,
things cost money, and you need
right.
people to go and see that stuff to, fund the other stuff.
No, I mean that's what I thought was that Watchmen was the first graphic novel I ever read.
Mm,
And I read it almost in one sitting. I think it was about two
mm,
sittings.
yeah,
I was just completely enthralled. And even in the movie, one of the and the movie got about maybe a tenth of what was in the book. One of the things I loved was the fact that these people, for all of what they did, they were also intrinsically human.
yeah.
They aged, they had traumas, they had issues, all this type of thing. It was such a different reflection. It got me. It touched me in a place that I didn't think a graphic novel, which I didn't even regard as anything more than
Mm,
ink and paper at the time,
mm,
touched me in a way I didn't know was possible in that medium. And I've said, in fact, when I finished my MFA, I did a whole semester where I only read graphic novels to kind of really dig in to that storytelling style.
okay.
Um, and because I had read a complete arc of Green Lantern one time,
Okay.
and everything. So I really wanted to dig into that as a storytelling medium. So I kind of spent a whole semester on that. I had my last semester, I had read everything I needed to read. I was doing my project on slavery in the antebellum South, needed a
Mm,
break from all of that. So I
oh
decided
yeah,
to be like,
yeah.
let's look at other forms of storytelling, and I got really experimental. And I know, but Watchmen absolutely got to me in a way that I did not think was possible at the time in that medium. And so when I did my MFA, I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely want to explore that more.
I'm
And
just
I
curious.
did and found great storytelling there in
Oh
really
yeah,
dynamic ways. So,
sure.
yeah, yeah, it was fascinating.
Did you? How did you feel about the film? Because I mean, that's a bit controversial, right? Like a lot of people had very strong reactions to it for a lot of different reasons. What was your take?
It was okay. There was
Mm,
just so much missing. And there was a lot of
yeah,
stuff that's
yeah.
like this would be important if you knew. This would be significant if you understood. Those things kind of like,
Right,
oh,
right.
this scene is great. Too bad you don't know why it's there. Like, there's no context for these
Yeah, yeah.
things because
Sure.
there's about 1/10 of the actualness. That's one where no movie, you need 3 seasons, 8 episodes streaming. Like that's one that should have been on
Yeah,
a streaming service
sure.
stretched out over time and was
Right.
crunched into this film that was too short and didn't give anybody nearly enough material. I mean, I loved it because I had already read the graphic novel, already understood what was going on, but there's a lot of people who that was their first exposure to that IP. And my
And
advice
that's
was
tough. That was
immediately
tough.
go read the graphic novel and everything in the film will make sense. So
Right.
I wasn't kind of like boo on the film. I was boo on the fact this was not the medium. This is not for film. This should be television. This needs to
Yeah,
be
sure.
episodic. And there's many episodic things that should be movies, but that was one
Yeah.
that's like, no, this should have been 8 episodes, 3 seasons streaming, sort of thing.
Right, right, right,
And
right.
really give it. And I think there's something that has done something like that. I have not seen it yet, but there's some Watchmen related project that is episodic that I imagine would be much better.
Yeah, so
Um,
they did. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, please continue.
Well, I was gonna say they did a HBO. HBO did come out. It was one season, but it wasn't the graphic novel. It was a continuation of the graphic novel. So
Yeah,
it
it
was
was an
like,
inspired by the universe of
right.
sort
It
of
was
thing.
sort of
Yeah,
inspired, and it was like fast forward, from like 85 to basically the modern day. It's
right.
funny. I really love the movie, and I gotta say, I love the show too. I did not love them for the same reasons that I love the graphic novel, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess there's more that can be said about that, but that's kind of getting off into the on the proverbial rabbit trail.
No,
But
no, no.
but I will say, I will say I think there were maybe 9 or 10 episodes. Again, it was just the one season that they did on HBO. I gotta say, Cameron, I think that 10th episode was maybe the best hour of TV I've ever watched. But
Mm,
there's a lot of lead up to it, and again, it was so much, like you said, it was so much richer because I was familiar with the original content, right?
right.
Whereas I think the reviews were very all scattered all over the place. So I think if people were coming to it again for the first time, or even if they just watched the movie and came to it, they might have been like, "Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening."
No, I mean, as with so many things, adaptation across mediums can and cannot work well. Speaking of the classical Greek stuff, I saw Troy many years ago with my
Mm,
dad in theaters, and he had had no exposure to classical literature at the time.
okay.
And it inspired him to go read a bunch of stuff, which was really cool. But I remember this one moment at the very end when he's dragging Hector's body around the walls of Troy.
Yeah.
And they have a great clip of Aeneas carrying his father out of, Troy and
Yeah.
this sort
Yeah.
of thing. And my dad leans over and is like, "How long was this war?" And I said, "7 years," because I took 5 years of Latin in high school, so I was in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
middle of, I had
Okay.
translation homework after
You
that
knew it.
movie, like
Yeah. Yeah.
literally, so,
Right.
um,
Right.
so, and it was like 7 years. It's kind of like, oh wow, that's really long for what's not in this movie. And I'm kind of like, sieges are very tedious. And so,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so, and it was kind of, but it was kind of like, yeah, this movie's done in 90 minutes. Like, yeah, it was 7 years. This was a whole book, sort of thing.
Right.
And a lot of the times, a lot of the characters and who they were and why they were important was not clearly explained, like when Aeneas is carrying his father. I literally
Yeah.
been like, fathers of the founders of Rome, very important.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like
There were almost
literally
these
Virgil named
cameos.
the whole book about the founding of Rome
Right.
after this guy. Like,
Right. Right.
so, it's yeah, and so which I am kind of like, I'm like, yes, and you're paying a lot of money for me to read about all of this in Latin, like that.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
so the adaptations don't always work well. But here's the great thing: it inspired him to go read the Odyssey and the
That's
Iliad
amazing.
and the Aeneid, and so in that way, it inspired him to go access that stuff, and that can be the power of a film.
No, absolutely right. And to me, okay, maybe part of this is just the fanboy in me, but especially when you're talking about some of these adaptations, right? Especially from stuff from the classical world, I have a relatively low bar. I don't always think that's a bad thing because I tell my daughter, you manage your expectations, you're going to be happier a lot more in life than the other way around, right? If you're
True.
sort of expecting the world, just very practical. But the other thing is, in my field, virtually everyone's seen that film in particular, and almost everyone
Mm,
hates it. And they all say
right.
the same reasons. Well, it's nothing like the poem, and it's, way too, and they take the gods out of it. They try to basically make Braveheart from this mythological story, right? It's like Greek
Right.
Braveheart, right? Where you're supposed to have, you have Apollo fighting on the battlefield, you have Achilles charging the river god, so on and so forth. But to me, and one of the classes I teach is a literature and film class, we read sections of the Iliad. We don't have time to read the whole thing. And then I also assign a book that, you were talking about, like war and trauma, by Jonathan Shea, called Achilles in Vietnam, where he was a psychologist, not a classicist, not in one of those cats, but he was a psychologist that was working with Vietnam vets with PTSD. And of course, this was someone in the early days of PTSD when people were first starting to have conversations about it. And
Right.
he found that he just struggled to connect with his patients. And not only did he struggle, but everyone else struggled too, right? But just sort of very haphazardly, he ends up bringing in a copy of the Iliad one day because he was just reading it, for his own enjoyment. Someone asked a question about it. He handed it to him and just said, "Hey, look, you can read it." And it turns out that this just sort of took off in the VA center where he was working. He was just passing out copies of the Iliad, and it was bringing a lot of psychological comfort to these guys. And again, many of which aren't college educated, never read the Iliad before. Many of them didn't even finish high school. Again, I mean, you have to think back to Vietnam era. America was a very different place, right?
Of course.
But they were holding up, he talks about in the book going back in and like that patient zero holding up the copy of the book and kind of like you saying, I read this basically in a night, which if you've ever read the Iliad, that's challenging depending on the, translation you have. Some read easier than others. And he
Right.
said, look, I don't know where this came from, but this guy gets it. Like he gets the heart of it, like what it's like. Because at the end of the day, it is a war poem, right?
Yeah.
And all that, I guess, to go back to the film, and really sort of my standard for a lot of these things is whatever sort of reboot, adaptation, translation, or whatever you're doing, does it capture the ethos, the soul of what you're bringing it from? And in my case, again, I really love Troy because I think for all the liberties it took, and it took great liberties, obviously.
Yes.
And there's definitely, it was not perfect. There are many, many things I would have changed had I made the movie. But I think at the end of the day, it did get to the heart of what Homer was trying to get at, right? And I think that's really all you can sort of ask of any adaptation. Not every
No. Yeah.
version's going to be for everybody,
No,
right?
we have to end because I have another recording.
Sure.
But no, I have the same complaint with Gods of Egypt. Everyone hated that
Mhm.
film, and I'm kind of like, yeah, but it also exposed people to a whole mythology that is not really discussed in
Sure.
the Western canon.
Right,
And no,
right.
it's not, that, but a sort of thing. But it's like as these sorts. I mean, I like it better than I liked 300, which really gets all the facts wrong, sort of thing.
No, no,
Um,
no. It's
sort of. So, I mean, I was like, yeah. So I totally get you, but we have to close because I'm in a day of back-to-back recordings, and I'm so sad. These are the discussions I love. This is the day I
yeah,
love my
sure.
job. And we could go on for another half hour, but
Well, real quick, I just have one quick question for you, Cameron. Where can I find your stuff? Because just as we're having this conversation, I'm like, man, this sounds pretty interesting. It's like I need to, maybe I should have done a little bit more research beforehand. But I mean, what should I Google or what should I search for?
oh, well, we'll do your plugs here in a minute. The story that I referenced in this episode with the hero is not finished yet, so it is
Okay.
located currently on my hard drive. But
Okay.
for the
To come.
current, yes, to come. But if you want to check out the current novel and the short story collection, they're both at CameronJournal.com.
Okay, I'll do that.
So under Cameron's books, and so you can check those out and order those, and we'll get some copies out to you. And yeah, but anyway, where speaking of books though, where can we find your books and where can we keep up with you online?
Well, thank you. So, as far as keeping up with me online, dimitrioslopez.com. Pretty straightforward, spelled just like it sounds. If you see the webpage with the very, pale white face, long white hair, and the burning purple eyes, you know you found the right thing. That's my antagonist. That's the vampire, the space vampire. Um, Also on Instagram, I'm kind of my head's going back and forth from whiplash with all the things that are happening with Twitter on the national level. But I've got a Twitter account. I think I'm still on Twitter. I think you can still find my videos if you again any search for Dimitrios Lopez or Thumos Rising will land me there. You can find me on Goodreads. Thumos Rising, Amazon, Thumos Rising. Again, reviews are much appreciated. At this stage, the book came out in July, and so every review is just worth its weight in gold. And
Right.
I guess finally, in terms of just purchasing the book, probably the easiest way to do it is just to hop on Amazon, type in Thumos Rising. It's the only book titled that. Should pop right up. If you see the book again with the purple eyes and that Greek sigma, you know you're in the right spot.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have a great day, Cameron.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.